Oops. Hello, everyone. I'm small. Let's see if I can get myself to be a bit bigger here. La, 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 la. Oh, hello. Welcome, everyone. Hope you can hear me. This is Tara Van Dyke, the host of Morbid Symptoms. And I'm very happy to have to bring shortly onto the stage Mr. Ryan Perkins, who's going to talk to us about the woke left, another CIA anti-communist operation. And he's going to be pushing back on, some of you may have probably more aware of this narrative in the United States, maybe than outside of it, that all this stuff that we would associate that gets called woke is often called cultural Marxism and Marxist and whatnot. And he has a very different counter argument to where this came from and what perpetuates it. But before we get into that, I'm going to do a little go into a bit of a document that was released. Oh, when was it released? In 1995, maybe? Let me add this to the stage. There was a defense of, okay, so this is a CIA report, and it was released, I guess, in 2011, but it was carried out in the 80s, I think, shortly after Ronald Reagan was elected president. And basically, it's their research paper on what's going on with the French intellectuals. And I just want to bring this up because it does two things, I think, that kind of frame this. It shows that this isn't just something that is a broader pattern. And also it gets into the interest of the Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence agencies in the capitalist countries take time to keep tabs on intellectual development, as well as other political maybe ideas and movements and what stuff they're going about, because this may come as a surprise to you that even though we're told over and over again in the West in particular that capitalism is fantastic, capitalism won, even with all its problems, it's the least worst system, and that communism and socialism are totalitarian and they fail. However, they can't just leave that to chance. They take an active role in doing whatever they can to make sure that whatever you want to call them, proto-socialist, communist, or actual ones, these experiments encounter as many difficulties within the country and outside the country as possible. And for why those state agencies would be interested in that, I will leave it to you to decide for yourself. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to read this whole report. It's about 12, 13 pages, or maybe 21. I'll add the link below in the comments later. But I'm just going to touch a couple of things to kind of set the scene, and then I'm going to bring Ryan on, and he's going to talk. He's going to take us through his research and his argument about the CIA being the ghost in the woke machine, and one of the main, and why would they be interested in that? The thesis would be, well, a fractured left is a contained left, and the more crazy you can make the left sound, the less average people, quote unquote workers, proletariat, whatever you want to talk about, however you want to say them, are going to be inclined to hang out with the trans women or women crowd, or abolish the police crowd, or this type of thing right off the bat, at least. So hopefully, if I bring this up, I can read it out to you. I just copied a couple of highlights. So let's see if I can actually see this, or if I'm going to have to share my screen. I may have to just, oh, it's not very big, is it? If I go like this, maybe. Okay. Don't worry about it. I'm just going to read this part out loud, and I will attach the link to this because it's not as big as I'd hoped. So this is from the CIA report on what's going on with the French intellectuals, the defection of the left intellectuals. So here it says, intellectuals have traditionally played an influential role in French political life, even though they have seldom sought a direct part in formulating policy. They have conditioned the atmosphere in which politics are conducted and have frequently served as important shapers of the political and ideological trends that generate French policy. Recognizing their influence on policymaking is difficult to measure. This paper focuses on changing attitudes of French intellectuals, engages the probable impact on the political environment which policy is made. So let's see. Okay. That dude on the corner is Foucault. The CIA, anyway. Intellectuals. So, intellectuals matter in France probably more than in most Western democracies. They have traditionally played a role in the political process as apologists for the positions of various parties and as important window dressing in the quest for domestic and international respectability. Moreover, they are listened to talk shows and magazine featuring heavy doses of intellectual debate are very popular. For a variety of complex reasons, the left has claimed the vast majority of intellectuals since World War II and has provided some of them with substantial leadership role. French intellectuals have routinely defended the domestic schemes of both socialism and communism and have led the charge against U.S. policies in Europe and in the Third World. So that is why they're interested in these French intellectuals. Let me see if I can find, sorry. Okay, sorry. I thought there was something else there. Let's see. Okay, new philosophers. New philosophers were motivated by two developments. First, the traditional leftist parties, pusillanimity during the student revolt of 1968 toward the scales from their eyes, causing them to reject their allegiance to the Communist Party, French socialism, and even essential tenets of Marxism. Second, by the early 1970s, most had also moved toward a searching critique of the Soviet Union, a trend accelerated by the publication in France. They mentioned certain publications. Under the stimuli, they re-examined the entire French and European leftist tradition. Two leaders of the 1968 of this movement, Bernard Henry Levy, which is still around today, and also André Glucksmann, wrote a number of popular books that tried to lay bare the fallacies of the leftist intellectual tradition. They argued that no socialism existed in France that was not implicitly Marxist, and that all Marxist thought is ultimately totalitarian. But the new philosophers more than compensated for their abstruse prose by becoming media personalities, defending their points of view in long intellectualized television and radio programs that the French relish. Their influence was primarily negative, however, and they had little to offer in the way of practical suggestions for new programs. All right. So let's see a couple of things. Yes. So again, there's this apparently before the end of the 60s, the bulk of intelligentsia was left to quite left, and also had affiliations indirectly or directly with communist and social parties, including the USSR. But what they're documenting here is how and why that changed, and why that's good for the CIA, because it's good for U.S. policy not to have intellectuals causing problems, making people too critical of what's going on around the world. So, causes of leftist intellectual defection from Marxism, in terms of Marxism, and also the politics of socialism and communism. The CIA writes, disaffection with Marxism as a philosophical system, part of a broader retreat from ideology among intellectuals of all political colors, was the source of particular strong and widespread intellectual disillusionment with the traditional left. Raymond Aron worked long years to discredit his old roommate Sartre, and through him the intellectual edifice of French Marxism. Even more effective in undermining Marxism, however, were those intellectuals who set out as true believers to apply Marxist theory in the social sciences, but ended up rethinking and rejecting the entire tradition. So defunct Marxist scholarship in the social sciences. Among post-war French historians, the intellectual school of thought associated with Marc Bloch, Lucien Favre, and Fernand Braudel has overwhelmed the traditional Marxist historians. The Annals School, as it was known for its principal journal, turned French historical scholarship on its head in the 1950s and 1960s, primarily by challenging and later rejecting hitherto dominant Marxist theories of historical progress. Although many of its exponents maintain that they are in the Marxist tradition, hence neo-Marxist, post-Marxist, this type of thing, they mean only that they use Marxism as a critical point of departure for trying to discover the actual patterns of social history. For the most part, they have concluded that the Marxist notions of structure of the past, of social relationships, of patterns of events, and their influence in the long term are simplistic and invalid. In the field of anthropology, the influential structuralist school associated with Claude Lévi-Strauss, Foucault, and others performed basically the same mission. Although both structuralists and the Annals methodology have fallen on hard times since they're accused of being too hard to follow. And if you've read some of this stuff, you can sympathize. We believe the critical demolition of Marxist influence in the social sciences is likely to endure as a profound contribution to modern scholarship, both in France and elsewhere in Western Europe. I just have a couple more things I want to flag from this CIA report, and then we're going to bring Ryan on. So again, the common theme is one of the things that the CIA was happy to see was that an increased anti-Sovietism, anti-communism, anti-mass-based political movements, workers' parties, this type of thing. The left intellectuals were moving away from that. And they talk about this quite a bit, and that's a common theme throughout. Okay, and anti-Sovietism as the touchstone. So a new left thinker and defector from the Spanish Communist Party was asked a question: what is it to be a leftist, in parentheses, intellectual today? And he responds, today, this touchstone of the leftist thought is a critical attitude towards the USSR, so hence communism, socialism in general, and in practice, of which one of the corollaries is to reject parties issuing from the Comintern tradition. The essential question is not the barbarism of Pinochet or the demolition of the Lorraine steel manufacturer or even imperial redeployment of Reagan. The fundamental question is that of the attitude of intellectuals towards the USSR, hence communism and socialism. So yes, so this goes on with that. And then finally, there's one thing here I wanted to, to touch on. So again, the CIA had people at some conference in Paris, I think it was the late 70s, and they reported back, a conference in Paris this year organized to consider the issue of French identity. Turned quickly to the lethargy of the French intellectuals and its implications for their future political role. Participants appeared to agree, that ideology, left or right, was unlikely to mobilize intellectuals in the future. The bad taste left by the disillusionment with Marxism in the mouths of virtually every leftist intellectual has translated directly into a kind of neutralism that has contributed to their immobilization. So I think we could say that this has been ongoing since then. Not much has changed. One part, and they go on to say that, in sum, the new left activism is likely to increase bickering between both communists and socialists, and within the Socialist Party, it'll probably lead to increased voter defection and apathy from both camps. And it goes on to say, I'm not going to read this last part, but basically, hey, this is great. We've gone over here. We've checked out the French intellectual scene. And they're into culture, they're into desire, they're into sexuality, they're into all this stuff. Expression, whatever, clearing the boundaries. I don't know if that was a thing yet. And basically, hey, this is great because this poses no threat to U.S. policy. So fantastic. Anyway, I'll share that later. And I'm going to bring Ryan up now and bring this down because let's see if it can be bigger. Because what I got from this CIA report, and of course it's redacted, and whereas it bolsters the argument you're making, they kind of say, hey, we're just observers. We're just observing the organic intellectual trends and then just commenting on them. We're not actually trying to shape or put our hands on the scale of these trends, which I think your articles, the one we're going to be focusing on today, but also the one I would encourage viewers to the other articles in your Substack or on Substack get into. But anyway, Ryan Perkins, welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for accepting my invitation. I was very keen on when a friend of mine, a comrade of mine, shared your article with me. He's Garrett Ramirez. I jokingly call him my deep state correspondent because he knows the ins and outs of all this stuff, at least from the American side, way more than I do. So he's like, hey, did you see this? I was like, oh, that's interesting. Anyway, Ryan, if you could please just tell us a bit about what you want to tell us about yourselves, and then yourselves. He's a they then. No. And then we'll get into the meat of the matter, the ghost, your argument that the ghost in the woke machine has a lot of CIA aspects.
So I'm a journalist based in Beijing, and I've been in China for quite a long time now. And this series of articles that I've been working on really came out of back in 2021, sorry. I found myself living in the West for the first time in 20 years. And what I was really struck by was the degree to which the people around me were just confused at what was going on. And they had no real idea of how they had sort of arrived at this point. And to be honest, I hadn't either, because I'd been out of the West for a long time. I'd gone back on trips and visited, but I hadn't actually lived there. So I followed international geopolitics and economics, but I hadn't really spent any time looking at the cultural side of things, or really taking a lot of time to sort of analyze what was going on in detail in the countries themselves. I actually spent a year in Canada in 2021. And I myself was slightly confused. I'd seen a lot of this stuff on the internet, and I thought a lot of it was being blown out of proportion. I thought it was being sort of sensationalized. But when I actually spoke to Canadians and I spoke to friends of mine, they were also sort of like confused as to where it had all come from as well. And I was getting these explanations where people were saying to me that it was some kind of Marxist conspiracy, or
cultural Marxism. Yeah.
It was cultural Marxism, and that's what sort of spurred me to go and look into it and to try and sort of track down the origins of where did this whole thing come from, and that was really the origin of that article, and it's also the origin really of, and it kind of led me on to the other pieces in the series.
Great, thank you. So let's just start off. We'll just go in order of the argument in your latest article, and I'll see if I can. I hope I have that. It's always nice when as I add to the screen. There we go.
Yeah.
So how the CIA created the modern left and why the right still thinks it's a Marxist plot. The Ghost in the Machine. Yes. So just to elaborate on what you already mentioned, there is this dominant narrative, especially from the likes of what's his name, James Lindsay, and a lot of the alt-right, that that all this stuff is just a communist plot or a Marxist plot. They shifted from focusing on class and economy to culture and transing kids, and there's no difference between male and female, and what, all that stuff.
Yeah.
That was, and also not that there was a change in tactic, but some of that was always been the goal, to undermine anything good about quote unquote Western society, because they want to make us all world economic blobs, like Wall-E robots in that movie. For you're a dad, so you might have seen Wall-E. And what you're getting at is that, well, hold on, there's behind that there could be something else going on that's more organized, and so if you want to flesh that out a bit, to try to people who are persuaded by this quote unquote cultural Marxist argument, because a lot of the people who sign on or play along with some of the really crazy excesses do also say they're Marxist or Marxist curious. And we will get into a lot of them have intellectual roots or formations from the, whatever you want to call it, Frankfurt School, critical theory, French theory, etc., whether or not that's bastardized or not. So I guess the first thing is to kind of lay out the thing about the argument that no, this is not cultural Marxism, or to the extent that that word has okay, you could call that, but what's driving that is not people utilizing Marxist-Leninism for political economic critique.
So when I first started to look into this, the key thing is that you have to, when you start working backwards, try to look at who's funding all of this, because it's clearly not just a grassroots movement. This stuff was clearly being funded. It's clearly coming down from above. And especially if you look nowadays at things like the ESG stuff, the environmental social governance directives, those are being mandated from the very top of the kind of capitalist class. They're being pushed from, you've got George Soros, his Open Society Institute, and even massive hedge funds like BlackRock are pushing ESGs, which makes you start to think that, well, it helps you to understand that this isn't a grassroots movement. There's nothing organic about it. It's being pushed from the top down. And then if you follow it backwards, you can follow the whole evolution of the entire ecosystem until you get back to its very foundation, which is in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And it starts actually in Berlin on a very small scale, where you have one half of the city occupied by the Soviet Union and the other half occupied by the United States and the Allies. And it starts there. It starts with a surge of funding and a surge of really a fight for control of the sort of cultural atmosphere in Berlin itself. But it's quickly kind of institutionalized, and enlarged into a massive program. So you see in 1947, when the United States agrees to rebuild Europe through the Marshall Fund, it decides, and it's a very conscious decision, it decides very consciously that it will rebuild Europe in a social democratic model. Not because it's particularly fond of social democracy, but because it needs to rebuild Europe as a bulwark against the Soviet Union and against the advance of communism. Because at the end of the Second World War, there's a huge surge in popularity for democratically elected socialist parties, and also a huge rise in the popularity of communist parties, because immediately after the Second World War, people have seen, people understand that the Soviet Union was primarily responsible for the defeat of fascism, and they are very, very interested in the Soviet Union and in communism, because to a great extent, the leaders, the memory of the pre-war failures of capitalism are still in people's minds. So the people then still remember the Depression. They still remember the Great Crash of 1929, and they also understand how poorly, that their leaders during the Second World War either collaborated with or were, largely incompetent at stopping the advance of fascism. So there's this huge surge in popularity towards socialism, towards communism, and especially democratic socialism in the West, even in the United States. And so as part of this Marshall Program, a huge amount of money was earmarked at trying to build Western Europe into a bulwark against the Soviet Union and against domestic communism in those countries itself. And they understood at the time that the appeal of the Soviet Union, it wasn't just a political appeal, there was a lot of ideological appeal. There was, the Soviet Union at the time was offering an entire intellectual framework. And so the architects of the program decided that they needed to have an intellectual framework that they could also offer people who were disillusioned with pre-war capitalism, and offer them something that gave the appearance of radicalism, that it gave the appearance of being revolutionary without ever actually questioning the underlying structure of the material structure of the system. And out of that is born in 1950 the sort of formalization of all of this, which is the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And very, very quickly in the 1950s, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CIA via the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and a few other smaller kind of associated programs, the CIA very quickly becomes essentially the largest sponsor of intellectual life in the West, and it's sponsoring academic exchange programs. It's sponsoring.
If I could just stop there for a second, because this is an argument that is somewhat out in the open. There was a man, what's his name? Rockill, Gabriel Rockill, wrote about it in Philosophical Salon about Foucault, I think in particular. And what I want to clarify, it's not. I'm assuming it's not like, hey, here's some CIA money, and and then you just kind of like can figure out, like, if you want to keep this money, you can probably figure out what you should focus on, not focus on. Or if it was more kind of anodyne sounding organizations and foundations and publications that just kind of thought, we like this, let's support that. Or was it a combination of the two? Because some people will say, like, for example, the CIA liked liked Adorno and Foucault, ergo Adorno and Foucault and Marcuse were like assets of the CIA. Or is it just kind of, so if we could just like, do you understand the question I'm trying to?
I do, yeah.
Okay, please.
So
your thoughts on that?
I don't think I think it ran through the entire spectrum of what you just mentioned. So I think a lot of the people whose careers were advanced and their platforms were provided by this by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a lot of them weren't aware that their careers were being advanced because of it. Some of the people involved were clearly, I think they were sort of intellectual mercenaries who were perfectly. I think a lot of them understood, as journalists do in the West now. Generally, they understand what's acceptable and what's not acceptable because they get paid for one and they don't get paid for the other. So it's quite easy for people to figure out, what they need to keep writing. I think a lot of them didn't realize that they were part of this program, especially on the artistic side of things, because as part of this program, you see a lot of aesthetics were promoted as well. So you have this sort of promotion of abstract expressionism and atonal atonal music and these kind of things. And I think a lot of the people were kind of unwittingly, they benefited a great deal from this promotion, but I don't think they actively sort of changed their outlook because of it. But I think some were clearly intellectual mercenaries who saw which way the wind was blowing. And it's like,
who would those be in your estimation? If you could name a few, who you thought were just kind of intellectual mercenaries.
Allegedly. I mean, certainly, if you look closely at the people who went from Trotskyism into the founding of the neoconservative movement, I would argue those people are more or less, just intellectual mercenaries. They understand who's paying them and what's expected of them. And when you look at the number of sort of people who moved from Trotskyism to just, absolute servants of empire via the cultural, via the CCF, Crystal, the Crystal family is one example. I would say that those people are very clearly just servants of empire. But I think there's probably a whole spectrum going from those that are just being paid and they know exactly who they're working for, to some who simply felt their way forward by getting paid and moving forward, and then some who were kind of unwittingly being promoted.
I know that I was what was it? I don't know if you're familiar with the Lacerdo book, Western Marxism, that came out it's an older book. I just mentioned it because they make this one of the distinctions they make is that I think it's especially I'll stick with the US example, because that was quite a different intellectual shift than what happened in France. Because of course in the States you had this this massive purging, the Red Scare and all this stuff that kind of probably also played a part in like, okay, we have to be really kind of careful about how if we're into Marxism, we use Marxism either analytically or politically, we got to be kind of use an interesting discourse for that, so to speak. There's that part, but also I do know that and I don't know how much of the actual writings of the Frankfurt School and in particular Adorno that you looked at, but it's quite clear. Then I don't know if it was shock from what happened in the Second World War, and them kind of conflating both the Soviet Union and Germany under this rubric of totalitarianism. But it seemed that at best you could say that the Frankfurt School, except for maybe Marcuse, was indifferent to the issue of anti-imperialism, or at worst, thinking that American imperialism would be a good thing.
Yeah,
and I don't. Yeah.
There's So the key thing with this movement was essentially that I think it was very cleverly crafted, because it understood that you couldn't simply deflect people back into the mainstream. What you needed to do was you needed to create an alternative left, and an alternative left that simply doesn't question the material structure. It needed to maintain that appearance of being radical. And this is where people like the Frankfurt School come in, because they're critical of capitalism, but not explicitly critical of imperialism. So they're critical of kind of the bourgeois norms, and what they've done is they've taken capitalism and reinterpreted it through a Marxist lens. I don't think they have, but that's what they would say. That they've done.
But just focusing on the more kind of cultural aspects rather than the factory and workers' parties and mass movements, because they definitely lost a taste for that. Anything big became bad, right?
Yeah.
So you have this, multiple epistemologies, the end of grand narratives. There's this micro narratives and logi and all this stuff, and it's authoritarian to try to install any kind of master theoretical, conceptual framework. I think that's why where they get off saying, well, Marxism is totalitarian, because it looks at the totality, not because it's trying to at least in theory, trying to manage every aspect of your life.
Yeah, there's similarities with Isaiah Berlin's sort of notion of positive and negative freedom, where he says, positive freedom is, you have the freedom to, whereas capitalism provides freedom from, which I think I don't agree with it, but you can see the echoes of that in Isaiah Berlin's work. But from what you were just saying, it's very easy to see how that then leads into the hippie revolution. Where the revolution is in your mind, it's not in the factory, where it's entire, the idea of revolution becomes entirely subjective. And
rebelling against mom and dad, because a lot of people who I think the shift from leftist politics and thinking, at least to being connected to labor parties or mass or labor in some way, to being about sex, drugs, and rock and roll and fuck you, dad. Sorry, whatever, that kind of rebellion, which has been and I'm not to say that there was no culture, that there wasn't anything about the culture that needed to be opened up a bit. But it seemed that became hyper-focused, that any kind of, that doesn't matter what the norm was, as long as you're pushing against it, you're thereby radical. And somehow, that's progress.
Yeah. But it's very easy to see how that's an acceptable form of revolution, because it's almost it's almost a consumerist form of revolution. And what's interesting is that is really one of the biggest successes of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, was the hippie movement. It may have been unintentional. It may, I can't prove that that was intentional, but it's clearly related. It's part of that same ecosystem, that same post-war intellectual ecosystem. And what it does is it cleverly defuses this demographic time bomb that started with the baby boomers. So you have the post-war baby boom coming of age in the 1960s, and it's a demographic time bomb. If socialism, if communism hadn't been subdued in the 1950s by the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the CIA's activities, this enormous demographic boom of young people, of radical young people, could have been funneled into a socialist movement that actually affected genuine sort of socialist or anti-imperialist change in the imperial core. But because of that movement in the 1950s, by the time that generation come of age, their entire critique of society has been kind of economically detoothed, and they have this subjective notion of revolution. It's the revolution of the self through
of the bedroom.
Eastern, Eastern spiritualism, sexual liberation, psychedelic drugs, which is it's very harmless from the perspective of the CIA and from the perspective of the capital class. That's a harmless expression.
I was just going to say that one of I know that feminists who are against the sex workers work mantra from this also kind of woke left would say if your feminism makes pimps happy, you may want to take a break. And I think it's the same thing. It's like if you're radical, I don't know, if self-expression or theory or whatever makes the capitalist happy, or the CIA like, cool, then maybe you want to look, maybe that's something
to
look
rewind.
But before we get into the Brezhnev guy, I want to, you mentioned the Congress for Cultural Freedom and this kind of winning of hearts and minds, soft power, or also in a way, so in terms of ideas and practices and cultural trends, that there was what you called an ecosystem. There was an apparatus that was intertwined in that, trying to, let's say, at least put their finger on the scale, so to speak, in addition to keeping tabs on it. So in addition, and I think you mentioned East Germany, but if you could, and I'm sorry, I can't remember if this is an article or not, you mentioned the Congress for Cultural Freedom as kind of CIA's cultural arm. Are there other known entities or nodes that kind of spread out or that are connected through that you can mention, so people get an idea about what this ecosystem or what this kind of cultural arm, hearts and minds apparatus, what the parts were?
So the Congress for Cultural Freedom was the sort of core of this intellectual program. There was a number of other associated programs that sort of operated through European Reconstruction Program offices under the Marshall Plan. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was a vast organization, and it sponsored like left-wing journals in all kinds of different countries. And what you see is that as that sort of transforms into the Institute for Social Research, which is then picked up by the Ford Foundation in about 1970. So the Ford Foundation really just picks up where they left off, and it picks up a lot of these programs. But the ecosystem, a lot of it was born out of this huge expansion of the university system immediately after the Second World War. And that in itself, I mean, that whole establishment was built out of security state spending as part of the Cold War, and that's where this ecosystem is embedded, and the money that's spent on developing this sort of anti-communist intellectualism, it's not direct. It's not constrained entirely within the CCF. It floods out into the whole university establishment.
No, for sure. It's just there's a supply and demand for things like gender studies masters and it's my favorite target, as you can see. Okay, so quite clear. So it makes sense. So there's the intellectual focus. They want to, what kind of intellectual development that they're like, okay, yeah, we need to have, and also radicalness and revolution. If it's doesn't cause a problem for imperialist foreign policy, and you can make a buck off it, then great. And then people can be upset about it or whatever, but it's all fine. So you have the focus on the intellectual ideas, and then I'm assuming also this might not be from the cult, maybe it's from the cult, same apparatus, but I remember growing up that they really want you really got the idea that socialism, communism is dreary, it's gray, it's authoritarian. Everyone has to look the same, act the same. There's no individuality. It's just all dark and dreary. And then if you compare that to the sexual revolution and the rock and roll and Woodstock, and now it'd be, I guess, Coachella or whatever it is, that makes sense that would be that would appeal, especially compared to the long haul of focusing on changing economic relations in the economy. It's a fair.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that one of the things that comes out of this Frankfurt school and a lot of the associated kind of intellectuals is ideas like social critique and intersectionalism. And intersectionalism is interesting because it's almost like a perfect ideology for the ruling class, because it's saying like it targets any form of social solidarity. So it says, okay, you're not just a person. You're not a person or a worker. You don't have anything in common with the people around you because, for a start, you're a woman. So you're at odds with the other 50% of society. But you're not just a woman. Like, there's all kinds of other things that intersect with that. So what you're doing is you're immediately destroying any form of kind of social solidarity by putting people into ever smaller boxes. And this is one of the reasons why these kind of intellectual ideas received so much funding, because they're ultimately very, very divisive, and they make society easier to control. Because if that's the nature of your revolution, if your revolution is against the other people in your class, then you're going to end up with a group of people who are completely harmless. And in that respect, the ideas that were funded were intensely individual. They promoted a sense of individuality, because individuals, it's easier to control a crowd of individuals than it is to control a group of people who understand that they have a lot in common with each other, and their interests converge and align. And so in many ways you can see where there's this idea, the ideas of kind of like rugged individualism were sort of weaponized in after the Second World War to sort of mobilize people against socialism. And all of those ideas like intersectionalism, like radical, and anything you care to think of, anything that has a divisive element.
Anything that would turn off the mass of the population they're all for, it seems.
Yeah.
And to get back on that in terms of the funding for this, it also allows both the government and private sector funders to kind of shield themselves in this kind of radical sheen, like we support indigenous epistemologies, or we support, a polyamorous, whatever. We want to look at, what we got to remove the barriers to trans inclusion, or whatever that is.
Yeah.
And it sounds good, and people make money, and people get cut up in that. But I think that what I want to, it almost seems like another life now. I did a lot of research in India, and they have this thing called vote. They call vote bank politics, and basically like vote banks and patronage and whatnot. And there, it's more along. There's a caste intersection with the class one, but the class one is still, because the vote banks usually are poorer areas. So they need some politician that's going to, help them not get their illegal water connection cut off, or it's going to like put a toilet block there or something like that. Youth center. But with this identity politics, you get both the political, you get these little niche markets, identity markets, but also it's great for patronage politics. Yeah. So you can kind of like, I'm going to cater, at least rhetorically, and maybe with a little bit of money, to this group and that group and this group. And then the other side is going to pick these various groups. And then it all comes about, the recognition like just I'm just saying what you said in a different way, that I think this very much identity politics has a very strong economic side and political side that are positive feedback loops with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because it's a subject of a different article at the moment, but that's also one of the ways, that's another way that's another way of weaponizing, of another weapon in foreign policy, is to is to say, to find an oppressed group somewhere, and
Uyghurs?
use Uyghurs or I'm trying to think who else. There's always an oppressed group, so like in Pakistan with the Baluchistanis, like
or all the gay people that Muslim countries all the gay people that Muslims are constantly throwing off roofs. Yeah. Allegedly.
Yeah, you go around the world and you just
Sorry.
Yeah. Just going around the world and find an oppressed group, and in some way, there's always a way that you can weaponize you can weaponize their alleged oppression.
All right, I want to. You mentioned, I remember, in your article, you called out this person in particular, and if you could just say how this man figures into the argument that you're making about who's behind, maybe the government and corporate interests behind what gets attributed to crazy cultural Marxists.
Yeah, Yuri Bezmenov, he's an interesting figure. So he defected from the Soviet Union in the 1970s and ended up in Canada. And he was working, I think he was working in Greece at the time when he defected. He was an undercover as a journalist for Soviet state media. So he defects in the 1970s, and he kind of becomes this celebrity in the 1980s, and in the late 70s and into the 1980s, with this amazing story about how the vast bulk of Soviet espionage isn't about collecting intelligence at all. It's entirely focused on cultural subversion and the ideological destruction of the West. And he has this enormously elaborate plan that he claims to know about, that it takes like 15 or 20 years to demoralize a nation, and then after the demoralization starts the destabilization, and then you end up in a period of crisis, and that's when the Soviet Union is going to come in, and they're going to do a huge regime change operation, and put in some Soviet government. Now, I don't know if you watch the videos of him, he's clearly a grifter. He's clearly
are you saying you could get the feeling that he's just kind of he knows his audience and is telling them what they want to hear?
He one of two things. He either just knows his audience and he knows what's going to work, or he's playing some kind of role. Because it's very clear now that all the Soviet Union's intelligence file, all of this has been declassified, all of this is known now, none of this existed. The Soviet Union operated a fairly standard intelligence service, looking for actual actionable intelligence. The idea that they were going to be able, even in their wildest imagination, to run a 25-year, massive destabilizing campaign for the whole of across the whole of the West is nonsense. But Bezmenov becomes a celebrity, a kind of celebrity in the U.S. intelligence circles with this story, and he appears on television. He's interviewed on sort of network television in the United States, and he ends up doing a series of lecture circuits where he explains this enormously elaborate fiction about this huge plot to undermine Western society. But I mean that even today, I hear people actually mention his name as being proof that this cultural Marxism was in fact actually, some kind of Soviet infiltration of Western society.
Well, and I don't know if you spend any time on spaces or talk rooms or whatever, but there was this one, I can't remember the name of it, but it was basically what you would call it, alt-right or whatever. But it was MAGA people that were upset with the Republicans. And I was on there, and these people were even calling people like Mitch McConnell communists. Cultural. Yeah. And it's just so it just becomes this catch-all for anybody that or anything that you don't like. It's about this long-term communist plot that's coming to fruition.
Yep. I mean, if you spend any time online, you'll hear people calling the World Economic Forum full of communists.
Yeah,
and it's like they're billionaires. I mean,
yeah. Globalists or capitalist communists. Yeah. No, and of course we know that and that makes sense that if you're in the anything that comes from you that's negative that you can project on your opposition, I mean, that's great. You know, I mean, all that's solid melts into air and whatnot. All the idea that it's not the capital accumulation, everything that goes on with that creates this increasing churn of breaking down thing, creative construction. No, it's the communists.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I've heard, I've heard and I've read people comparing the WEF to communists because they're talking about taking away all the farmland from small scale farmers. And it's like, yeah, but they're just taking it away because they want it. Like they're just stealing it. Like if someone just comes to your house and steals your stuff, that's not communism. That's just theft.
Yeah. Or the idea that anything that happens through the quote unquote market is fine and fair game, but anything that happens from a state actor or a collective institution, then somehow that's that's terrible. But yeah, I mean, it's again, I should, when I read things like your work and that thing from the CIA, I should be more sympathetic to people because it's kind of the water that's all around us.
That's it. Yeah, I think that article that you read, I think that was very interesting because that shows. I think that shows the extent of the success of this movement, of essentially cultivating a left-wing intellectual ecosystem that it has the veneer of radicalism, but it doesn't actually advocate for any kind of radical change in the material structure of society. And that's the key. That's why it keeps getting funded. And you can see that carries on. So it carries on until 1970 when a lot of these programs are just picked up wholesale by the Ford Foundation, which had earlier worked with the CIA. Anyway, that had a long history of working with the CIA. And then as once after the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, these programs are picked up wholesale by George Soros and the Open Society Foundation. And it is expanded and it's doubled down on, and it's made not just Western Europe and the United States and Canada, I know Australia, obviously. Then it's expanded and really doubled down on in Eastern Europe. And
if you could talk, do you I don't want to, if this is part of a longer term project that you're working on, you can feel free to come back later and tell us. But could you talk a bit more of that? I have heard things in passing about how intricate the Open Society NGOs were with things they call color revolutions in Eastern and former in Eastern Europe. Is there anything you can add about that, or?
I think they were very, very heavily implicated in a lot of that stuff. They slipped into a lot of these. They slipped into a lot of the Eastern European countries during the 80s. So as part of Glasnost and Perestroika. So they get in the 80s. There's some really interesting figures running around not Victoria Newland, Christia Freeland. Christia Freeland is there with the Open Society. She's in Kiev with the Open Society Foundation in, I think, the late 80s. And her mother is there as well. This is before Ukraine is even independent from the Soviet Union. And so she's in there with the Open Society Foundation. Her mother is there as well, perhaps a little later, maybe in the 90s. And I believe they were pretty heavily implicated in definitely in Romania. Definitely in Romania, because Romania was really holding out against that sort of wave of counter-revolution. When you look at what led to the revolution in Romania, the counter-revolution in Romania, it looks very similar to Ukraine in 2014.
All right, and I just wanted to let's see, where we talked about Yuri Bezmenov, and now the Open Society. Yes, and I remember when you mentioned the Ford Foundation. I can't remember the book it was. Oh my God, but it was talking about. It was in the United States, and it was talking about. I think it was Black colleges and who funded these Black colleges. And again, the Ford Foundation comes up, but also Sears. And it was this idea that, okay, we have to, how can you kind of guide the intellectual activity of African Americans in a way that's not that's not going to be towards us, socialism, Marxism, etc. There's a fantastic book about that it's just kind of, again, you have this again, the focus on race relations rather than class relations, centering them, so white privilege, white supremacy, this stuff. And I'm not saying that those weren't there in the culture, but it's interesting that these rich white families were quite happy with funding research on racism. At these, what they call HBUs, historically Black universities. So again, in terms of manufacturing consent, it doesn't have to be heavy-handed. A lot of it comes, what gets from your point is just where the money is and where the jobs are and where the cultural recognition is, and you're like, hey, these are nice people, and the World Economic Forum is great to me, and and they have Tallahassee coats on, and isn't that great? And it's Open Society, fantastic. But I don't want to, you're a journalist. I don't want to pigeon. So, your politics, of course, are a factor, but not dominant. But what do you see? Is there any way, do you think this dam breaking on the quote unquote left? My theory is that the post-war left is dying, and we need to let it die so that something else can come up of it. But a part of this is there's a lot of wounds, especially coming from being a person that was never on board with trans women or women. I can tell you that was a fantastic operation, to the extent it was an operation, to divide the left, because there's a lot of people still to this day on the left that are convinced that if you have any issue with gender ideology, you're just a far right Christian fascist, right? And that materialists will look at you and call you a transphobe if you say, look, I don't care what you want to call yourself or what you're doing, but you're not there's no word or operation that can turn you from a man to a woman. And still to this day, there's people who just will call themselves even Marxists, not just left, but Marxists, and still cannot see who are constantly flagging with psyops, but for some reason can't see this one.
So I think one of the interesting things that happened is after the end of the Soviet Union, you head into the 1990s, and there's a very clear convergence with both sides of the political spectrum all across the entire West. They suddenly are in almost complete agreement on almost every single issue of major importance in terms of foreign policy, international alignment. Any sort of any meaningful difference between those two sides evaporates. But what you see happen at the same time, and this is after kind of after this cultural program moves under the stewardship of the Open Society and the sort of the NGOs and the National Endowment for Democracy type stuff. What happens is, as the meaningful difference between the two sides collapses, the sort of Overton window closes, the volume on these social issues, social and cultural issues, is turned up to 11. And it is turned up absolutely to fever pitch. And I think part of the reason why that's done has been to hide the fact that it actually makes no difference. It makes no functional difference who you vote for, because whoever you vote for is going to implement exactly the same neoliberal, neoconservative agenda as the other guy. But that makes it all the more important to make them look very, very different. And how do you do that? You do that with a series of, you do that by amplifying a series of cultural and social agendas, which, whilst I'm sure are super important to the people involved in that conversation, make no difference to the ruling class whatsoever. Like they don't care. They don't care what the outcome of those conversations is. You know, they don't care about trans rights. They don't care about gay rights. They don't care about anti-racism. Like none of these things are important to the people in charge. What remains important is keeping the system exactly the way that it is and making sure that nobody actually is paying attention to how the system works. And the best way to do that is to keep people
a buffet of scapegoats, yeah, because you're already inclined or acclimated what your eyes on, and so it can be, you know, the whatever, it can be the homophobes or the transphobes or the Islamophobes or the, you know, the Antifa or the KKK or what, you know, immigrants, all this stuff. You know, and that's really the issue, or that's in a way of understanding why you have this, you know, anxiety or this growing precarity or anxiety. Yeah. And the left treats this like nobody's business. And I wanted to make sure I asked you, because you're based in I don't know, I don't want to, like, you know, if you want to say where you live, that's fine. I'm saying
I'm based in Beijing.
Okay, he's lives in Beijing. So find him if you can, Soros. No, but you met. So what do has any of this woke madness or seeped into China at all? And what do people make of this when they're over there looking at what's going on in the UK, in quote unquote left politics, or in the US? Are they just like, what is this?
For the most part, people, yeah, I think most Chinese people find it slightly strange. For a start, it hasn't really seeped in here. Partly because the Chinese government do a very good job of making sure that none of those NGOs are here. They do a very good job of controlling their information space. Because of course you have to remember, in Western Europe, all of your information is controlled from the United States. You know, if you're on Facebook, if you're on Twitter, if you're on Instagram, all of this, you know, all of this is being controlled by somebody in Silicon Valley, or it can be. And so one of the things China does is it does a very good job of controlling that information space, making sure that its information space is sovereign. And it doesn't allow any of those sort of NGOs. So fortunately, none of that stuff has managed to kind of, I would say very, very little, almost none. But I think in general, most Chinese people don't actually really know about it. And if they do know about it, they probably are in a similar situation to the one I was in, which was thinking that it's been blown out of proportion by the internet or the Western media. It's probably not as bad as they think. And then there's a small a smaller number of people who spent time in the West, and I think they're just confused by it.
Yeah. No, and since you are of British descent, I just would kind of flag that this whole Your Party thing, with Zara Sultana in particular, but also Corbyn, kind of says that there's still this, I don't know what you want to call them, like the PMC or the NGO left hasn't learned their lesson. I don't know if you caught her when she was on stage. I can't remember. She was on something in London, and she basically said that there's no room for people with social conservative views in a socialist party or in your party. So basically, and would say, like, if you're not going to center the marginalized, the marginalized of the season, if you're not, it's not enough to be tolerant or whatever, but if you're not actively pro-trans or pro-immigration or pro whatever,
and you have to be vocally pro.
Fuck you, you're out. Nothing here for you. I mean, it's just like, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, how that's they still haven't figured out that doesn't seem to be a recipe for growing your coalition.
I mean, I think they are very, I don't think there's anything radical about them. I think when you look at what's described as democracy in the West, essentially you're voting for a corporate representative. You're voting for a corporate salesman. Which salesman would be best at selling me the decisions that have already been made on my behalf? Like, who do I want to tell me what decisions have been made? You're not voting really for people who actually make the decisions. Those decisions have been made behind closed doors in advance. And then you, at the election, then get to select who's going to inform you of that information. And what they've started to realize is that people no longer believe the old cast and crew. They don't buy the old show that they've been shown. So they're sort of rummaging around. They're rummaging around for a new set of actors that will be slightly more convincing. And I think, Corbyn and Zoltana are part of that on the left. And then on the right, you have Nigel Farage and, whatever else he represents. But I don't see anything interesting or radical coming out of that. And I think what you just mentioned about that sort of rejection of social conservatism very much shows that they are just in the same mold as the rest of the left has been stuck in. I don't think they can represent any sort of radical break.
Well, and also of course, I'm aware that there's different types of socialism. Even in the Grundrisse with Marx, he spent a lot of time being quite critical of different branches of socialism. But this cracks me up. It's like, yeah, you can be, sympathetic, but it's all like, it's centering the quote unquote most marginalized. How is that a socialist thing? I thought it was about replacing the working class, which is the majority of the population, should be in control over economic decisions, not the small bourgeoisie or financial sector. What the F does that have to do with any of this other stuff? Which, it's just interesting to me. It's like, what? So, yeah. It was crazy. I was like, here we go again. They still haven't learned anything.
I was just going to say, one of the other factors in as this sort of volume on all of the social and cultural issues was turned up to 11, is that there are other driving factors, and one is this sort of crisis of capitalism that's happening in the West. I think that a lot of the forces, a lot of the capital class and the forces driving this understand that they're in a very deep sort of economic and financial hole. And they understand that people's lives are, people's material existence is going downhill quite rapidly. And for that reason, it's very, very, as you mentioned, it's very important to have them pointing fingers at each other. It's the immigrants, or it's the anti-trans people, or it's the trans people, or it's this or that. I can't see an end to that kind of like material decline in the West, which means that as that continues, they're going to have to turn the volume up again and again and again, and sort of divide people into smaller groups. And that culture war, the right calling the left Marxists and the left calling the right fascists, serves, it serves a really important purpose in today's.
Well, Kamala Harris, remember her? They're wheeling her out again, and she was on some talk show, I can't remember, and she said Trump was acting like a quote unquote communist dictator. We're all communists now, baby.
I thought he was a fascist last week.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, same old, but I want, and also in terms of maybe it's kind of sad how again, because I don't want to give, it's important, and I totally agree that it's important to understand the ghost in the machine, as you will, the parts, putting their finger on the scale or funding it or various things to that help explain why certain things take off and grow and persist. That looking at me like, why is this a thing now, and why is it everywhere all of a sudden? But if there wasn't the contradictions or the fault lines in the left, this wouldn't be so effective, I think. And of course, there were, I think it's odd to be an anti-communist, anti-proletarian leftist, but it doesn't mean everything was fantastic in those, in those, what do you want to call them, experiments or ongoing, actually existing socialism. But of course, capitalism isn't either, but capitalism gets multiple opportunities. Socialism and communism just get one, and fuck that shit. It didn't work. We all know where that ends up. Gulag, done. But the left in particular,
they're also under constant siege. They're also under constant warfare. So I mean, people criticize the Soviet Union, but it's like for the 70 years that it existed, it was under constant attack. It was
they were beset inside and outside,
and sanctions. Yeah. So I mean, if you look at Cuba, if you look at Venezuela, and if you look at any of these, like when the communists came to power in China, the first thing that the United States did was they stole all of the gold reserves and the foreign currency reserves.
Yeah.
So like when Mao came to power, it was literally bankrupt.
Well, and that's why it's so funny when you have people on the liberal left, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Bill Maher, these types.
Oh, but, yeah, I can't.
Yeah, but oftentimes whenever Marxism or socialism or communism or any kind of thing that freaks them out starts to get a bit of cultural purchase, he's going to have something on, basically some sort of, listen, children, we tried that, it failed, move on. But I want to talk again about if there wasn't such a nutritional soil in the quote unquote left for these types of shenanigans or these types of things to work, I think we also need to look at that. And I'll just use an example before we wrap up, before we go to sum up and final thoughts, etc. Is that when something emerges that tries to go against the grain, like the ACP in the United States, the American Communist Party, and they are either, the people there are actively against the woke stuff or just try not to engage in it, and they're trying to work, the workers and this and that, and they're not, this kind of stereotypical cultural Marxist lefty. The gatekeepers and the established left go after these guys. And most of them are guys. That's one of the things they critique about them, but they're basically in their 20s. And they'll be like, oh, I was on their Discord and someone said the F word, or they made a joke about a lady. And so they're against trans, or they're not trans. They're not, again, supportive enough. I don't know if it's jealousy or what's whatever. It's like, God forbid again, this thing about the oldest dying, but it's not just the obvious opposition that's trying to thwart something new on the left from growing, but this post-war left as well. It's just amazing to watch. You can't make any mistakes. You have to have all the right, suitable for work speech, or you're just a CIA plant or a fascist or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key takeaway is that this new kind of post-war left is a completely synthetic creation. You know, it doesn't have any grassroots, and that's one of the reasons why it's one of the reasons why it comes up with all this. When you look at a lot of the ideas that they've come up with, when you look at this agenda, it's completely unsustainable. None of it is going to really work in the long run. If it was grassroots driven, it wouldn't be focusing on trans rights as much as it is. It wouldn't be focusing. It would be actually trying to address some of the issues that people face. And I think when you look at that hostility between, as you said, the new sort of post-war left and anything that represents kind of traditional socialist left, it's very clear where the funding is coming from, where the direction is being driven from. And it's about undermining any form of solidarity, that can resist this kind of like relentless march of these sort of faceless bureaucrats and interchangeable, this completely interchangeable set of politicians with identical policies.
Well, and I don't know if I'll just use this as an example of people who should know better. And what I don't know, maybe it's when people get into their 50s or 60s thing. But Vijay Prashad, for example, are you familiar with Vijay Prashad from Tricontinental? Okay, so he's anyway, he's kind of like as popular as like a Yanis Varoufakis type. And he writes a lot about anti-imperialism and whatnot, and he's based in India, or was based in India. But anyway, he went on Jackson Hinkle's show, I think Designated Targets or Legitimate Targets or whatever, and they had a nice conversation. But then apparently he must have gotten the call from somebody who informed him of some off-color joke that Jackson Hinkle mentioned, or that there's like some homophobia in the ACP Discord, and he literally posted like an apology online for for going on this thing and wanted to make clear that gay liberation has been central to Marxism or socialism since the beginning, and this and that and the other. And I'm just like, how it's just so crazy. I mean, and fine, fair enough. If he was like a raging crazy person, fine. But it's like, oh, well, they made a joke, or again, like it's again because he also, I think he's an Orthodox Christian, and so again, it's this thing that it's not enough for the old new left or for the post-war left establishment. It's not enough for people to be tolerant about these things. If you're not actively supporting it and excited about it, you're suspect, and you're not really, you can't be really part of our party here, whatever that is. Insane.
This post-war left is an extremely effective. It's an extremely effective system for closing down debate outside of very, very narrow terms that it works on.
Yeah, and I felt I should have to apologize to my aunts next time I'm in the States, because I remember when I was going into college and I went through my feminist period, and they kept on trying to say, like, most of us weren't doing that. And I came from a very very working class, solid the earth family, and both on my dad's side and my mom's side. And so when you start going through that college point stuff and you start coming, and they just be like, and again, a lot of union members, this type of thing, and they're kind of looking at you like, that's not really what we were concerned about. And now I have to go back and like, okay, I get the point you were making. Anyway, so what do you so if you could say what project are you working on now in relation to this, and also what would the main takeaway be for people who are either became I don't know, I want to say useful idiots, but
Mhm.
are in a milieu where
Mhm.
this cultural stuff, this identity politics stuff, and the crazier the better is kind of what's foregrounded. But they're reachable.
Mhm.
What do you think your research could help them, your insights could help them with? And then the people who are like, are realize that something has gone way sideways, and that that we want to get back to, either we have to have a separation from the left and socialism and Marxism, communism, whatever, or figure out a way to have a kind of counter hegemonic battle within this thing called the left to push some of this really onerous stuff out of it. What would you say
Mhm.
to keep in mind?
I would say I mean, if you're involved in this kind of new left movement, um, you need to, I think people need to take a step back from it. Yeah, yeah. I think people need to take a step back from it, because if you take a step back from it, it's you can see that even its most ambitious aims, like its most ambitious aims, are are essentially aesthetic change.
Mm,
You know, it's at best going to affect aesthetic change. So, you know, perhaps you might have more faces of color here or there, or, you know, different people administering the system. Um, it's not actually going to affect any really meaningful change. So at best, these movements will create aesthetic change. And at worst, you end up just sliding into nihilism. It's
mm,
just, you know, once you move into this subjective, um, you take on board this subjectivism.
mhm,
It's not even aesthetic at that point. It's uh, essentially just an exercise in nihilism.
mhm.
Um, and
Well, narcissism, yeah. I mean, my little
yeah,
identity, my feelings, my likes, and somehow, again, this is a bit of magic. This is, I mean,
mhm,
I don't know who came. Maybe they put a lot of fertilizer and see what comes up. But this notion of turning anything into an identity and then raising that an identity to being something that you have to support, affirm, whatever.
mhm,
It's like, isn't that convenient? If I have some sort of a curiosity or some sort of weirdness, then that's my identity.
yeah,
You know,
and
and
it's
who are
actually
you
not
to
very
tell
important.
me that I'm not, a wolf or whatever it is?
Yeah, yeah. But I think if you
My
take
truth.
which is what mhm. I think if you take a step back from it, which is what I was trying to do with that article, if you take a step back from it, you can see the evolution of this. You can see
Mhm,
the evolution of the subjectivism, the this, you know, intensely individualistic notion,
mhm,
um, and you can see how it evolves down to today, and how it's a very, very effective weapon against any form of solidarity, any form
mhm,
of actual meaningful movement that can affect some kind of structural change.
mhm. Well, and I think also, I mean, that if you look at any kind of metric of well-being, uh, it hasn't contributed to any kind of well-being. People
Yeah.
becoming like more neurotic. There's more every day. I mean, I don't know. I'm a Gen Xer, but I remember when there wasn't very many medical, like psychological issues, and now, especially when I listen to my kids, it seems like 70% of the kids in their class have some sort of learning issue
Mhm.
or social
Yeah.
issue. And there's all these kind of special rules and dispensations, and I'm just like, this is madness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, this is Ryan Perkins. Thank you. It was lovely chatting with you. I really enjoyed your article, and I have bookmarked other
Thank you very
ones
much.
to read further. His Substack is The Anti-Imperialist: History, Economics, and Geopolitics, and it's on Substack at Ryan Perkins. And he is a Beijing-based multimedia journalist, again, discussing history, economics, and geopolitics from an anti-imperialist perspective. So please do check him out. Yeah, so great. Thank you very much, Ryan. I don't know if there's anything you want to plug or add, or I'll give you the last word, or the last word.
Two more installments. Two more installments in the post-war American Empire series. Next couple of days will be the rise of the military-industrial complex, and part 6, which will be the panopticon, which is the rise of the domestic repression industry.
Well, we will have to have you back on, Mr. Perkins.
Thank
you so much. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Yes, and I hope that we can. I hope that this can. I'll keep an eye out for your posts, and we'll see when we can meet again to keep track on this crazy beast. So anyway, enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, Ryan.
Goodbye.
All right. Oh, I'm big again. That always freaks me out. I don't want to be big. Okay, so that was Ryan Perkins. And again, he came on to talk about the woke left, another CIA anti-communist cultural operation that kind of gets in the ghost in the machine that behind the familiar ideas of identity politics and anti-communism and kind of decentering of mass-based worker mobilization mass-based politics that was not entirely or primarily an organic development. But of course, what we see with the French side is that there were internal splits, maybe more organic splits, that then people were able to cynically or opportunistically jump on, and then decide the money actors decide whose research to support, what institutes to support, which ideas that they want to platform and boost, to use the parlance of our times. So please do check out Ryan's work. And I will, for those of you who aren't familiar with the CIA report on the mass deflection of the French intelligentsia from socialism, communism, Marxism, I will add that link to the video comments. Please do like, follow, subscribe. And I will be back on tomorrow with, around noon. Is it noon? Yeah. Noon UK time, 7 p.m. Beijing, Taiwan time, with Hey Yu's coming back. And he's a anti-imperialist political commentator, anti-imperialist rapper, entrepreneur based in Taiwan. And he's going to come on, and we're going to discuss China and the West's ongoing identity crisis. Really, the West, particularly with the United States, but the West in general, struggling to realize that China they have to deal with China as a peer, or perhaps even a superior in the short, when it comes to both economic development, military capacity, and diplomacy on outside their Asian region. That's what I wanted to say. Anyway, join us then. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a nice rest of your Saturday wherever you are. And I'm going to drop myself down here, and I'm going to put on the outro so you can see where you can go to support and follow Morbid Symptoms. Thank you.